Everybody knows we will be recording this for later so that people can watch it if they weren't able to make it today. So my name is Monica McCoubry. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and I am located in the Lincoln office. And I'm going to really quickly have my co-host today introduce herself as well. So Allie, if you'd like to.
Hi, everybody. My name is Allie Mays, and I'm the Community Science Specialist at Game and Parks.
All right, thanks, Allie. So if you all have questions today, I do have you all on mute just so that we can hear everything and no one has a little oopsie or anything like that. So if you want to go ahead and type in any questions or comments or concerns that you have in the chat, you can either send a private message to Allie or to the rest of the group. Chances are if you have a question, more than likely I bet someone else might have that same question. So please feel free to utilize that chat. And again, if you've never used it, it's very clearly labeled at the bottom of your screen. It says chat. Just go ahead and click on it and it should say everyone or to Allie, whoever. So, all right. Hopefully everyone is here for the science of mosses and lichens today. So I already see some questions. I will try to get there. I promise. So I'm sure people are really excited. This is the I think the largest number of people we had registered for any science of. I think the last time I checked, it was like 169. So I kind of expect a lot of people to be on today, which is great. I'm so glad that this is reaching such a large audience. So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen for you guys. I have a lot of information to share with you today. So it might be just a little bit longer for those of you who are used to a science of. Sorry, my computer here is not being nice. All right. All right, so hopefully then everyone sees the big screen and not the presenter view, hopefully. Okay, thank you. All right, so like I said, this is the science of mosses and lichens today. So we're going to be talking and sticking to these two bigger topics. When I first started doing this research the other day, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a short PowerPoint. I don't have a lot to talk about. That's not true. I found a lot of really cool information. And even today, Allie shared some other information that I didn't even find when I was doing this research. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about mosses and lichens, which are things that really get overlooked. People think that they're just kind of useless and they're there. There's a lot that goes on and they're very cool, actually. There's a lot of cool things that happen with these. Just as a really quick reminder, make sure that the stuff that you put in the chat is appropriate and it kind of sticks to the topic at hand. Otherwise, we can remove you. I barely had any problems with this, but just so that everybody knows, Allie can kick you out if you're not behaving. So. All right, so I want to talk to you guys a little bit about just an introduction to lichen and mosses. So what are these things? Are they the same thing? I hear a lot of people ask me, well, they're the same thing. They're very different from each other. So to be honest, I probably could have done a whole separate science of mosses, science of lichen, but I did put them together because a lot of people group them together, but that is actually not the case. So what is the difference? So lichen and moss, like I said, they're usually clumped together as being kind of a long, big term that people use for both of those things, but they're very different. Most of the time, moss has been used to describe lichen as well, but again, they're two totally different things. If you look at these photos here, the green photo is moss, and then the yellowish orangish one is lichen. So if you just study those photos, you can see that there's a huge difference between them. One of them looks really leafy. One of them has a different color. The substrates that they're on are going to be different. So even though they kind of grow in the same area, they might grow together. They are two very different organisms. So both of them, when you find them, a lot of the time they are small, not always, but they are sometimes small, and they usually grow in shaded kind of moist areas. Sometimes people say that they're mushrooms. They're not mushrooms. They're not vascular plants, so they don't have that specialized support tissue that conducts water and nutrients, like for instance, like a fern or something like that. But they are both what we call cryptogams. So basically what that means is that they do not produce seeds and they do not produce flowers. All right, so mosses, in simplest form, they are a multicellular organism and they have little leaflets on them. If you ever get down and really study moss, they have those tiny little leaves and little branches off of them. They're actually pretty similar to trees, ferns, and wildflowers. Again, a little different, but more similar than lichens would be. They don't have that specialized tissue though, that phloem and the xylem. They don't have the things that transport the water and the nutrients, just because they're not vascular. Oftentimes when you find moss, it is very short. It is very small to the ground. This is basically because they act like a sponge and they have to absorb, like a sponge, that water and nutrients. So if they grow really tall, they risk the chance of drying out up at the top. So that's a lot of the times why you see moss is very slow growing and it's very short growing. All right, so lichen then, I just learned this today, thanks Allie. So lichen is actually sometimes 3 organisms, but it can also be 2 organisms depending on the type of lichen. So basically it's like an algae fungus sandwich. There's algae in there. There is sometimes 2 different types of fungus, sometimes just 1 different types of fungus. And they have this symbiotic relationship with each other. So simply meaning that both parties are going to benefit. And Allie was also talking before we started this today that is where the term symbiosis came from, is from looking and studying lichens. That is where that first term kind of came up. So again, in the simplest form, the fungus or fungi will surround that colony of algae. The algae will then provide the food through that process of photosynthesis, while the fungus will then protect the algae from drying out and then from damage to the sun. So they both mutually benefit. We'll talk here in a little bit when we get more into lichen. Some people disagree, some scientists disagree that it's not a symbiosis relationship, but instead it's a parasitic relationship. So even to this day, scientists still have a problem specifically defining it. Is it a symbiotic relationship? Is it not one? All right, so when you group them together, here's a photo of lichen and moss together. So you can see them side by side. They're very different. When a lichen is wet, it will kind of become visible through the top layer of that fungus. This is kind of what we call by turning it on, I guess. It's most likely at this point when it's wet, it's photosynthesizing because it has that water. When it's dry, the lichen is going to be turned off. It's most likely not photosynthesizing just because it doesn't have that water to do so. But when it's dry, the lichen actually has very vibrant colors in it. When you see it a lot like on a rock or a tree stump or the ground or something, it's going to be usually very bright in colors. It could be red, green, dark black, yellow, orange, red, lots of different colors. So to tell them apart, lichens have a very diverse growth form, and we'll talk about that later, but they don't have leaves. Moss have leaves and they're almost always a shade of green, but lichens are not. So very simply, that's lichens versus mosses. And we're going to go ahead and go into a little bit more detail. Do we have any questions before we get started, Allie? Or are we kind of doing okay?
Yeah, so Marilyn had a question about a field guide for lichen, and one that I know of is Lichen of the North Woods. I have it there in the chat. Another question, Monica, was about where can people view the recorded videos from this series?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did have that in the last slide. So if you don't get a chance to write it down here, it will be on our Nebraska Game and Parks Education YouTube channel. So I do have it on the very last slide. I will show you. So if you forget or didn't write it down or something, we will talk about that as well. Good question.
And then another question from Ethan that you might answer in a bit is, are the different colors of lichen different kinds?
Ooh, good question. We will talk about that, Ethan. So just keep watching. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about moss to begin with. So breaking it down a little bit more, what is moss? So moss, and also you might have heard something called a liverwort or a hornwort. This is a kind of a collective group known as a bryophyte. So when we talk about these things, they're kind of all grouped together. They're different species, but they are collectively known as that bryophyte. So these are some of the most primitive plants that you can find. They're still around today. They've been around before dinosaurs. They were here way before ferns, and they're often overlooked. They're often viewed as a very simplistic organism that doesn't really have a lot of purpose or value. That's definitely not the case. Both of these organisms that we're talking about, lichen and moss, have huge environmental impacts, and we'll talk about that too. Everything from air quality and helping air pollution. Moss is also very diverse. It is second only in the number of different types and species to that of flowering plants. So thinking about all those different types of green plants or different types of plants out there, moss is actually very diverse. When you look at it, it might not look like it, but it's actually very, very large in variety. All right, so what exactly is moss? So it contains chlorophyll, which is that green stuff that helps them produce their own food, but they don't have true roots. So we talked about that earlier. They act like a sponge and they don't grow very large and tall because they can't risk that drying out. So then how do they support and transport that water and those minerals in there? Well, they basically sit and then they just kind of absorb it like a sponge. The leaves themselves, those green things, those are actually called leaves. They can absorb the water directly into those chlorophyll containing cells. So they're not very thick. So that is the way that they can absorb them so quickly and so efficiently. If you think about a sponge, like the second you put it in water, it absorbs all that water, very similar to the leaves of moss because they're not very thick and then they can just absorb them very quickly and efficiently. One thing is you usually think of finding moss in a very humid, kind of a wet environment, which that does. They love that and they prefer that. However, they can survive being desiccated or dried out for even months. And within a little as like 2 hours, they can, by being rehydrated, they can come back to life, basically. So they can survive desiccation. They have that adaptation. So even after just a few hours of getting back by water or being in water, they can kind of come back to life, which is a very cool adaptation. All right, so botanists consider these things, moss, to be the oldest plants, some of the oldest plants in the world. Some of these bryophytes even date back to 450 million years old. That's 50 million years before things like ferns even appeared on Earth. And when you think about it, or when you see photos of dinosaurs, or if you go to Morrill Hall, you usually see ferns in the background. What about moss? So moss has been around a lot longer. However, we're not exactly sure because the fossil record is very sparse. They're very fragile. They don't preserve well. So we don't have a ton of information about how long they've been around, but this is a good scientific guess. All right, so how many different types of species? When you talk about bryophytes, those liverworts, the hornworts, the moss, moss is definitely has the most. There's about 20,000 different types, or sorry, 10,000 different types of them. Liverworts, there's about 8. Hornworts, there's only about 2 of them. They can be found just about anywhere from lush tropical forests, arid deserts. Even the Arctic is a great source to find moss. Sometimes it's a very good food source for a lot of animals in that area. Just to kind of put things into perspective, there was not a lot of information about Nebraska or even the Midwest mosses, but one I did find is that just North Carolina alone, they have 450 types of bryophytes year round. So that's quite a bit for some place that you would not think of as a moss territory. When I think of moss, I think Pacific Northwest. All right, so how do mosses generate and what does their life cycle look like? So this is getting a little technical, but it is the science of moss and lichen. So here we go. Their life cycle basically goes back and forth between meiosis and this fertilization, and also haploid and diploid. So if you remember right, haploid, diploid, it talks about the number of chromosomes sets that are found in a nucleus. So haploid meaning 1, diploid meaning 2 sets. So to start, that haploid, basically the spore, goes to a good location. Okay, this looks good. I'm going to plant myself here. So that spore will then germinate the structure that kind of looks like algae. It's very small to begin with, and that's called the protonema. So this structure is where it kind of starts. It plants itself, it starts to branch, and you can often see them if you look on moist trails or even in the soil. You can actually see these things happening. And this is what kind of people recognize as moss. It's very low growing, but this is just the start of their life cycle. So really quick, talking about their sporophytes and the gametophytes. Again, getting very technical here, but a sporophyte is just the stalk portion that's going to emerge. This is part of the reproductive system. And the gametophyte is that leafy green part kind of at the bottom. So when you see something like this, just remember the sporophyte is that reproductive part. The gametophyte is kind of the bottom leafy green section. All right, so that leafy gametophyte, the stuff at the bottom, will then mature into the reproductive structures that will then produce the sperm and the egg. The male and the female structures can form on the same shoot or on different ones, just depending on the species of moss. The male structure is called the antheridia, and it produces that motile sperm. They have the little whip-like tails, if you remember looking back in 9th grade biology or even before then. They use that to move to the female so that the egg can be fertilized. So then that egg and sperm form a zygote, and that begins the diploid the sporophyte generation. So again, that 2 set of chromosome generation. Basically then they kind of dependent back and forth on each other. And then the gametophyte is what gets the nutrients and the water. The sporophyte has the foot and the stalk and the capsule, and then that capsule is where the spores are produced, and the spores will go, they will find a suitable location, and basically the whole life cycle starts over again. A lot of mosses have asexual reproduction just because this is the part where it becomes identical to the parents. But a lot of the cells of mosses have the ability to grow a whole new plant. So it's pretty sometimes efficient to just do asexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is a lot of work. All right, one group of mosses that I did want to talk to you guys about is just because it's the most diverse and it's probably one that you're going to find. They're called true mosses. So there's 2 different growth forms of this true moss. There's one that's called an acrocarpus and a pleurocarpus. So if you look at the 2 pictures here, you can definitely see it different. The acro one is a little bit more upright. It's a little bit more branched. Few to no branches. The bottom one, the pleurocarpus, has the branching, but it doesn't usually stand upright. It kind of goes laterally and it's closer to the ground. So 2 different types, but it is both are true mosses. I have a lot of people ask me, how do you ID moss? Well, it's very, very difficult, especially when you do it in the field. There's not a ton of field guides about moss just because a lot of people don't study it. It's something that, again, is overlooked, and a lot of people just don't have that knowledge. So when people do try to ID it, these are the different things that they look at. They look at the growth form. They look at the costa shape. This is that thick structural component at the bottom of a moss. They look at the shape of the leaf. The book that I was looking at, it had 19 different leaf shapes. Just in very simple form. That's just 19 that you might find. And if you're really good at looking at mosses, there could be 26 different leaf shapes. They also look at the leaf size, the leaf apex, is it round, is it sharp, the leaf margin. Some of them have like the outer parts of a leaf. Some of them are going to be toothy, some of them are going to be rounded. And then is it branching? So that is related to that growth form. The ones that are highlighted or the ones that are bold, these are the ones that experts will look at in the field. Some of them, like the apex of the leaf and even the margin of the leaf, are so tiny that you can't see them in the field. So what they use is the growth form. They look at the shape of the leaf, if it's possible, and then they look to see if it's branching. If they can figure out these 3 things, they can usually get it to a general order or a family of mosses. So where do you find moss? Pretty much anywhere, but they like cool, moist, and clean areas. So when I say clean areas, they mean like clean areas, not polluted. They don't like a lot of nitrogen in the air. They like places that are clean, and just like we like places that are clean. They can grow on living or dead trees. A lot of times you see it growing directly on the soil or even on dry rocks. And they also like man-made structures. How many of you guys have seen old cement trails, like cement blocks that have moss growing between them, or even on roofs? Sometimes you will see like older roofs, the shingles will have moss growing on them. It just depends. Those are good locations and moss will grow there. Each species of moss, though, will grow in a specific habitat. So if you see one on the trunk of a tree and you see one on a roof, they might be two totally different species, even though they look exactly the same. But it all depends on the temperature, the moisture, the light, and then the chemistry of the substrate. Is it really acidic? Is it basic soil? It just kind of depends. All right. So when we talk about bryophytes, just in general, I just wanted to put this in here. This is about every different type of habitat that you can find them. So this is liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. You can find them in the soil. You can find them on rocks. You can find them on tree trunks and the bases of trees. All right, so why do we care about moss? What are the benefits of it? It's extremely important. It helps prevent and slow erosion, especially when it grows on rocks or in open ground. It will kind of band together, and then the soil won't erode as quickly or as fast. There's a lot of insects that also benefit from living in the soil, and the moss helps provide them cover as well. We talked a little bit earlier about moss being a good food source for some animals that live in places like the Arctic or the tundra. This is a really good food source for them. And then a lot of birds will actually use their moss to line their nests. It's soft, it's clean, it's something that's natural, and they like it and they will use it. A lot of people will use peat moss to line things like diapers and cribs. They used to do this. So in World War II, it was a very short supply of cotton. So basically what they use is peat moss. It's what they had. It was very advantageous to use this. There was a lot of it. It was abundant. It's also very absorbent. So again, hence the diapers. And then also its natural antibiotic qualities that make it even more absorbent than cotton. So they used it quite a bit. Not so much anymore, but it is kind of cool to know that they did use that. All right, what about today? Dried moss is used in packing things like vegetables, plants, fruits. A lot of people actually put it in their lawns as a soil amendment. So if you put it in a sandy soil, it's going to hold in moisture. If you add it to clayey soil, it will lighten the soil and improve that aeration and drainage. Some people in countries even use peat moss as a fuel, which is a billion-dollar industry, used for monitoring heavy metal contamination, very similar to lichen in streams and rivers. It's also used to monitor air pollution. So again, they like clean areas. If we see a lot of moss in a lot of locations, scientists can kind of estimate, okay, those places are probably very clean. They don't have a lot of heavy metals. There's not a lot of extra nitrogen in the air. If they start seeing that moss disappear, then they might need to recheck that air quality and air pollution, because there's a reason that those mosses aren't sticking around or they're dying. All right, so that was a lot of information on moss, maybe some more than you ever wanted to know, but do we have any questions or anything like this? Yes,
Sure.
someone asked the hedgehog. It is not native to Nebraska. Thanks, Allie.
So Beverly wanted to know if there was a field guide for moss that you knew of, and a couple people posted some in the chat, but if you know of any others.
Yeah, I had a really hard time finding any for Nebraska specific moss. I see someone put detailed key to lichens for Minnesota, but it's again kind of applicable to that of Nebraska. Yeah, if you can find one that's like Midwest or Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas area, that might be helpful too. Again, a lot of places and a lot of people just don't study moss. There was very, very little information I can find about Nebraska specific, unfortunately. So yes, if you please know of something, please put it in the chat, because I had a really hard time finding something.
Great. Ethan had a couple questions. One was if fungi start as spores too.
Yeah, so we did a science of fungi, I think last year. Yeah, it was sometime last year. And so when they're very little, they all start as spores. If you've ever collected like morel mushrooms before, a lot of people will tell you to collect them in a bag that has holes in it or has air able to get in it because you're leaving a lot of those spores there. And that is how those mushrooms will then reproduce. Good question.
And then there were a couple questions about animals in moss, and I know you talked about it a little bit, but can you expand more on animals that might live in the moss and then also animals that eat moss?
Yeah, so animals that live in moss are going to be, it could be anything. Like we talked about how birds really like to line their nests, but a lot of animals like insects or like arthropods or like earthworms, they're going to live in those areas because moss will not only, it's not only soft, but it also holds in water and moisture. It's going to be an insulator for the cold. So a lot of animals will use that to live in or underneath. And then animals that eat moss or lichen, it's going to be a lot of your herbivores. So lots of rabbits, deer will eat them, even some rodents will eat it too. It's just going to be kind of something that they can find easily, especially out in the winter time.
Great. And then we had a question about, this is kind of specific, but does this webinar count for NAI credit? Do you know?
It does not, no.
Okay. Okay, and then one more. Jackie wanted to know if there were any regulations on gathering moss on public lands that you know about.
Not that I specifically know about in Nebraska. I read a little bit about how they collect it. I'm assuming it's going to be like, especially in a state park, it's going to be very similar to like an animal or a plant. Leave it alone, basically. However, I know there are people that collect lichen and moss because sometimes that is the only way to identify it. So is to take it back to a lab and to look more closer detail. So I'm not aware of what those are, but we could certainly look that up and figure that out for you. So.
Okay, great. Thanks,
All
Monica.
right. Thanks. All right, so now we're going to move on to lichen. I hope you lichen this part here. All right, so what is lichen? It appears as a single organism and everyone thinks it's a single organism. There's actually three. It could be three, it could be two, again, depending on the type of lichen. But basically it's that fungi algae sandwich. So fungi will provide the overall structure of the lichen, and then that population of algal cells, which we call a photobiont. This lives inside, and this is what is going to photosynthesize to make that food. So again, a lot of people think it is that symbiotic relationship. Some people call it a parasitic relationship. Whatever relationship, they both are working together somehow. Depending on the type of lichen, will also depend on the type of algae that they associate with. So it could be green algae. It could be that cyanobacteria, which is blue-green algae. It could be both, depending on the type of lichen. We talked about how there's that relationship with that symbiosis. There's a lot of lichen out there. From what scientists have gathered so far, there's about 14,000 species in the world, but there could be as many as up to 50,000 species, just because, again, it's not a thing that's very highly studied. Specialized relationships between those lichen is what we're going to talk about a little bit in a minute here, but they are found just basically anywhere. Very similar to moss. They can be found from poles to tropics, basically anywhere. One thing that I did want to point out is Allie kind of mentioned this earlier today when we were talking, but for about 140, 150 years, scientists have definitely thought that lichen was strictly two organisms. It is a fungi and it was an algae. Up until recently, they think that it could be up to three, depending on the type of lichen. So there is the algae, and then there could be two types of fungus. One of them could be I'm so sorry, I have a hard time pronouncing this, actinomycete, and then there could be this newly developed or found form of the basidiomycete, and it's a type of yeast, which is a type of fungus. So again, it just depends on the type of algae and the type of lichen and the type of fungi that get together. The yeast is thought to be important for the shape of the lichen. However, like I said, this might not be all types of lichen. It might be some. It just kind of depends on the type and the species. But it's kind of neat that we thought for the longest time, 150 years, that yep, it's two organisms. And then all of a sudden we've studied it a little bit more, and now it could be up to three. All right, so this fungi and lichen kind of relationship here, a lot of the fungi that comes and associates with lichen is going to be the sac fungi or the acetomycete. And again, some of that yeast as well. There's about 30,000 different species of this sac fungi. Only about half of them are used to form lichen. So that's still 15,000 different types of fungi. Due to a large number of that unrelated fungi, not all of them, scientists believe, evolved from the same ancestor. So the lichen they think could have been split by different ancestors, but then they kind of came together because it's the way that they use and the mode of their nutrition is what links all lichens together. So they are together, but they're still they evolved separately and differently from each other. And like I've mentioned again, scientists just can't come to a conclusion whether they think it is a level of symbiosis where both parties mutually benefit, or some think it is a parasitic relationship where one benefits and hurts the other. We aren't exactly sure. They can't really come to a good conclusion on that. All right, so light is extremely important when we talk about lichen. So all lichen will photosynthesize. So they use the energy and the light from the sun to make sugar and to make their own food. So they need light to provide that energy to make their own food. The algae in the lichen will produce carbohydrates, and then the fungus will use those carbs to grow and reproduce. So this is where we get that symbiotic relationship. But again, not all of us agree on that. Depending on the species will also depend on the type and the amount of light needed to grow the lichen. Color is also where the lichen will change depending on the color and the light. So if there's a lot of light, they might be a different color depending on the species. If there's not a lot of light in the area, it might be a different color. Some species that are found in really hot, bright environments like desert areas, they are usually going to be with the ones that are generally more colorful. They have more light and are able to produce different color and lots more pigments. All right, so the different growth types, there's 3 different types of growth in lichens that I want to talk to you guys about. So the very first picture that you're looking at, the very top picture on the left side, we call that a croutose lichen. So this one is going to be very, very close to the surface. It's very hard to remove, and you can't really damage it. You can't really remove it without damaging it. They're very hard to identify. Scientists have a hard time identifying these, but they think that about 1/3 of all lichen is this croutose lichen. So it grows very, very close to the surface. Something a little bit different is a foliose lichen. This has a distinct upper and lower side, and they sometimes are detached from the substrate. So if you look at this one, it looks like it's on a tree branch or some bark. It's kind of like flowery and leafy almost looking. So it is detached from that substrate, not at all like the one that I talked about earlier, the one that's flat against that. It looks like a rock on that one. These can actually get fairly large, about 12 inches, or they could be a few millimeters depending on the species. There is another one called a fruticose lichen. This one kind of hangs down like a pendant, or it looks almost like a beard. These are found a lot in the Pacific Northwest, and they get really large. They can get up to a few meters in length, but if you're not finding them in the Pacific Northwest, they might be only around a few centimeters long. So very, very different in sizes. Lichenologists, or people that study lichen, they basically group them into 2 different kinds. There's the macro and then the micro. The micro ones, they believe that you need a microscopic examination of them to identify them. The macro ones, like the ones that you've seen here, you can somewhat easily identify them if you know what you're looking at. All right, so some lichens will actually produce something called a fruiting body, which is very similar to that of a true mushroom that you see. So they produce this fruiting body, and it's called an apothecia. I have a bunch of different types on here and a bunch of different varieties. Some of them are bowl or disc shaped, but this is where the spores are produced. Some of them are flask shaped, and just again depends on the kind of lichen that you're looking at. But not all of them will produce those fruiting bodies. The ones that do, this is how that sexual reproduction, it's actually very inefficient when we talk about lichens, because every spore that goes out has to be able to find a suitable algae to get it to be lichen. That's a lot of algae and a lot of spores. So in this sense, asexual reproduction is actually more efficient. It will just be that identical copy of the one that's already made, where it can easily find that algae. And I thought that was kind of interesting on this. All right, so the shapes and structures of them, it is very, very diverse. The surface can be rough or smooth, but if you ever get a chance to touch lichen, there is this little powder on it. It kind of looks like salt. If you touch it and then look at your fingers and kind of rub your fingers together, it is very similar to salt, but this is basically just the cortical cells that are eroding, and it forms very small crystals. And that crystallized structure, that salt structure, is what you're going to get on your hands. This is normally on the surface of what we call the micro lichens, and they think it protects the layer of the fungal hyphae, or the parts of the mushroom, called the cortex. So to basically help this, what it does is it hinders that CO2 diffusion. So the little tiny parts on top of that lichen have holes punctured in them, that are called that pseudocyphellae, and that is how that diffusion works. So there's tiny little holes or pores on top of it, on top of that cortex, that allows the air and the CO2 to diffuse through it. All right, so where are you going to find lichen? Again, just very similar to mosses, pretty much anywhere. Some of them have a special strategy where they can completely dry out and not die. However, they do have to rely on some sort of humidity and some type of either that or dew sometime in their life, otherwise they will die. They can't live without it forever. So during times of drought, a lot of lichen can survive and go to places where vascular plants just aren't able to survive. This is going to be a lot of places like barren soils or poor quality soils, rock surfaces, barks of trees, wooden stumps. They're going to colonize those areas that vascular plants just don't have a lot of luck in. But again, they still need some type of humidity or some type of dew to survive. Most of the time you will see them on north growing sides of things, just because that is where the most likely amount of dew or humidity is going to hit them so that they can still survive. All right, so why do we care about lichens? Not only are they cool to look at, but they are considered a keystone species. So keystone species being right up there with, for instance, like a prairie dog. A lot of people don't like prairie dogs and thinks that they do a lot of bad things, whatever, but they still have a lot of other animals and resources that rely on them. Otherwise, a lot of things would collapse. Very similar to lichen. So a lot of health and ecosystem, they're linked to certain kinds of lichen. So if that lichen wasn't there, that ecosystem could fail or even become very, very unhealthy. They serve as a food source for lots of different animals like deer, birds, rodents. They provide a lot of nesting materials for birds. Hummingbirds will actually use lichen a lot to line their nests because it's small enough for them that they can carry them, and they also look kind of nice. They also protect trees and rocks from the elements like rain, wind, and snow. They're also very, very good at used as an indicator and measure of air quality. So again, we talked about that with mosses, very similar to lichens. The U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service uses them as a biomonitor to assess the air quality around the country. So they've taken about 5,000 lichen samples to evaluate that air quality. They also look at pollution. Some of the air can be deadly for lichen, but some can survive on a very high amount of pollution. So if you think about it, if you see lichen that really like high nitrogen levels in an area, you're going to have to assume that there's a lot of nitrogen in that area. If you see those start to decrease and go away, and the other lichens show up that don't like it, then that nitrogen level has changed. So these are really, really helpful in measuring that air quality and even that pollution within that ecosystem. There are some that love those heavy metals like we talked about. There are some species that will actually die or their growth will be slowed due to the amount of heavy metals in the air. But again, some love it and can thrive and survive in that area. They also act as an air scrubber. So they trap very, very small amounts of heavy metals in the air, very similar to how plants in a wetland will grab pollution and kind of diffuse it in the water, very similar to lichen. They absorb those smaller pollutants like sulfur, mercury, nitrogen that can be very bad for other animals and plants in that ecosystem. All right. So that was a ton of information, and I know that it was very technical this week. There was a lot of big words for you and me, but I appreciate you hanging in there with me. Next week, I just want to point out to everyone, we have 2 Science of left. We have next week and the week after. So this next week here, we're going to be talking about threatened and endangered species within Nebraska. Snow leopards, rhinos are great, but we're going to talk about things that are in our state. And then the next 2 weeks, the week after, February 18th, is our last Science of, and we're going to be talking about wetlands. Grace Gard and Ted LaGrange are going to be doing probably 90% of the talking that day. Ted LaGrange is our wetland biologist here at Game and Parks, and Grace Gard is our aquatic education specialist, 2 very, very good people and very versed in wetlands. And then if you're looking for more information, I've had a lot of people ask me, where can I view these again? Or how do I look at the other ones that you've done? You go to our Nebraska Game and Parks Education YouTube channel. Just Google search that. And then if you go under playlists, you can look at Science of. We have some different Nature Tales, which is our pre-K video for younger students. We also have a Facebook page. It used to be Nebraska Project Wild. It is now Nebraska Wildlife Education. You can also look at our Instagram page. And we also have the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission's main page, which is our wildlife education. We have lesson plans. We have more information on there. We have free resources for anyone if you want to check them out. So we have a lot of cool, more information. It just doesn't stop here with Science of. All right. So thank you. We'll have some time for questions here. Hopefully I can answer and help you answer some of them. And then next week we have threatened and endangered species. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can look at all of you beautiful people here. Yeah.
Hey,
All
Monica. So there was a question about what Spanish moss is classified as.
Oh, good question. I don't know on that one. Sorry, I'm trying to have to share my screen and then stop sharing it. I don't know what's going on here. Okay, there we go. All right. I don't know about the Spanish moss one. That's a good question. I would have to look that up. And I am by no means an expert in mosses and lichens here. I did a ton of research for this. So I am totally okay to say that I have no idea what that is. That's a good question. All right. Anything else?
Sure. Emma asked if there are any lichen or mosses in Nebraska that are harmful to the touch.
Ooh, another good question. I didn't come across of any that I was looking at that are extremely harmful or deadly or anything like that. But just like a lot of other plants and animals, just be very cautious. The rule is if you don't know it, you don't know what it is, don't touch it, don't eat it, obviously those kind of things. So, but I don't think that there are any harmful ones in Nebraska.
Okay. Great. And then Ethan asked if moss was one of the earliest planty things.
Yeah, it probably is one of the earliest one. Like we talked about 450 million years old, about 50 million years even before those vascular plants like ferns showed up. So scientists believe that it's one of the earliest types of plants, if not the earliest. Good question.
There's another question from Laura. Is Purina powder harmful to touch or ingest?
I definitely wouldn't eat it. Again, if you don't know what it is, I would just not touch it and leave it alone, especially with a lot of fungi out there, especially if you don't know your fungi. Do not touch them, do not eat them. They can be very harmful to touch and taste. So again, I would just kind of leave it alone if you don't know what it is. All right. Well, if any of you need to go, we will be here for a couple more minutes to answer some questions, but I appreciate everyone coming today. This was a really good learner for me because I really did not know a lot about mosses and lichens. I was one of those people that kind of overlooked them as well. So, and I do also want to thank you, Allie, for being a great co-host and answering the questions in the chat as they came in. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, all right. And if anyone has any other questions, you can view this on our education YouTube channel as well. Or I will go ahead and put my name in the chat and my email. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email us for everyone here. And hopefully, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and email me. There we go.
Monica, you put your email in the chat for the waiting room.
Yes, and I just did it for everyone too.
Okay.
So, yep, I saw that mistake. Thank you. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next week for Threatened and Endangered Species. Thank you.